It's such a pleasure to introduce Creighton Baxter. Baxter is a Brooklyn-based artist who explores temporality, remembrance, and the sensorium, transforming images and gestures through repetition. She has been commissioned to create performances for Boston University and the Geffen Contemporary at MoCA Los Angeles, and has participated in exhibitions at Andrew Krepp's Gallery and David Castillo Gallery, among others. Her illustrations appear in the Yale Review and Duke University Press. Baxter holds a BFA from the School of the Museum of Visual Arts and an MFA from Yale University. The drawing in the exhibition by Baxter is one of the first acquisitions I made when I started at the Allen. Baxter gave us permission to share with students that it depicts the moment when she felt the first effects of seroconversion, the presence of HIV antibodies in her blood, as she was swimming in the Pacific Ocean. It quickly has become a favorite work for students and professors of art, gender, sexuality, and feminist studies, and creative writing. I came to know Baxter's work through a performance she gave at Boston University, where she beckoned a full room of spectators to come closer to her over and over until we were all in a heap, holding one another and crying. Her performances are pregnant with precise gestures that unfold slowly. Her drawings are likewise beautiful, dark, and often diagrammatic. It's such a pleasure to present her work in this context among artists with whom she's in a kind of kinship and carries on the lineages of. Her talk today is titled, A List of the Present. Please join me in welcoming Creighton Baxter.
You're late. Right now, in the center of a labyrinth, scattered with statues of Saint Aloysius, between a church and gymnasium, is a boy's bathroom, hovering in the pit of a classroom building. She sits in the one stall that locks, with the metal walls of it beaten, punctured, scarred, and scratched. Boys percuss the stalls each day with X-Acto blades and ballpoint pens, scrawling their text and symbols into a swell of glimmering carvings. And in the now of her tide, she surveys their efforts as she hides. With her feet levitating above the toilet, she reads the walls. Her eyes are rubbing on everything, scrubbing away parts she works to forget, but senses a small whisper to look. Her eyes tap over the words faggots, die of AIDS. Grate up against jaggedly incised hate symbols, descriptions of extinction efforts, scribbled paragraphs proudly detailing acts of rape. She scrubs and scrubs. Now the stalls are the color of Genvoya, medicalized seafoam, zapped green. The walls are cream, and they match the painted flesh of Saint Francis of Assisi, who hangs in a frame above the sink, watching. Her eyes keep squeaking across the painted hate stall, her sharp orbs, removing color to reveal the luster of her hiding place. Now her vision trips over a drawn woman. There are two girls in the stall, one floating above the toilet who can speak and sometimes breathe. The other is a marking made against a surface, redacted, scraped away, removed through her own presence. A symbol. She was more of a ghost than a drawing, more of a line than a woman. And the sometimes breathing girl wants that ghost so deeply, she draws her own cock between its thighs. She makes the eyes glow and draws a halo around her head. A her, split between the flesh and wall, gaze at one another, green-eyed, the color of seafoam even. There is a now where they find her in a classroom. 15 boys hold her down as the priest is watching. They sever off pieces of an unborn pig to feed her, an animal fetus, belly up in a green tray. She tastes a dead ear on the tongue. She spits out formaldehyde as her drawn cock wobbles through a chorus of laughter around her. Together, the boys and priest examine her fearsome genital, the mythic dick of a young girl, like an eel slapping her ribs in pursuit of return. A now of 7 days since the pig and the classroom, she is gripped again, covered in the piss and seminal fluid of her classmates. The now of throwing glass bottles at a 14-year-old trans girl. A now of trying to run her over with your car. And even later now, where you pull her hair so hard, it begins to rip from her scalp. She is gasping. You pull harder. You hit so swiftly, she imagines her cheekbone is breaking. Now your hands grip her throat in the blue projector light. There is a now of Los Angeles, within a room of only curved walls and a gorgeous broken tub. Her hair is covered in blood. The nurses pull drains from her scalp, and she can no longer smile, but she glows something fearsome as she rests for the first time. She lies there in a now of siblings wiping red from her mouth before feeding her the little green pills she danced for. It is a now where she starts dreaming of trans women as living clocks. A nowness of night terrors in her healing. A now where she thought her tolerance for nonsense died. A now where she can smile again and starts to eat everything. The first now of controlling the cut, conducting a symphony of violence toward her own divinity. Her sutures are a crown in this list of the present. There is a now right before she meets you. And the scar left from men pulling the skin from her skull has healed into a slightly crooked line at the margins of her face. It is a halo to match her cock and glowing eyes. But right now, you've pulled at her so hard she falls asleep in response to the grip. She leaves your bed, your room, your yard, your little black car. She is moving even faster now, leaving the stall, the classroom, the hospital, the alley. A trail of pig bits and green shit tumbling behind her. After you, she still talks to old lovers in a now where the light is different. She's been watching trains in it. There is a bench here down the street from her broken little room. A now of 16 years since she left Arizona. Her hair is long down the black and blowing. It is hers, like how right now my legs are mine. Now my mouth, now my throat is mine. Now my belly, now my hips, my clit, my cock, my tits, my breath is mine. Now my mind, my scar. Now my spine, my virus. Now, my medicine is mine. They all sit with me on her bench. The light is gorgeous here. You should try it sometime. In 2017, while I was living in Los Angeles, I had just moved. I had just retired from being a sex worker, and I met a man, so it goes, and I was sexually assaulted by him. And about 2 weeks later, I went to the Pacific Ocean. My mother, I grew up in the desert. I grew up in a landlocked state. And so the ocean was this place that was obviously incredibly far away. And it was also a place in my mind and my spirit that I would venture to as a child as a means of escape from the hellfire that I grew up in. But my mother, when I moved to California many, many years ago, would tell me to find the horizon line at the ocean when I experienced moments of distress or uncertainty. And so I went to the Pacific Ocean, and I was swimming in the water for hours. And if any of you have ever been caught in a riptide before, you understand that riptides pull you further and further out. The only way to escape from a riptide is to swim diagonally and forward to move out of the current. And so I found myself in a riptide, and I began to swim diagonally and forward, as I have seemed to do every day since then. And I remember being crashed many times by waves and taken under. When I finally got out of that fucking riptide, I felt my head breach the water, and I began to experience what were clearly my first symptoms of seroconversion: nausea and chills. I was very lucky some years before that to have had a partner who was living with HIV. And so I was tapped in enough to understand what seroconversion was like at that time. Because of that man and my ability to notice what was happening, I was diagnosed shortly after that. I have been an artist, decidedly so, for 20 years. And after my diagnosis, I stopped making art for a while and had essentially given up. I lied on a resume, and I got hired to work a very entry-level job at an art gallery in Los Angeles. And while I was not making art at that time, I was looking at art all the time. I predominantly worked in performance for about 10 years. And then 2020 happened, COVID happened, everything went into lockdown, and I lived in this tiny apartment in Los Angeles. The text that I read at the beginning, I wrote at the same time I made this drawing in 2020. I was in my first real relationship after my diagnosis as I was making this drawing. And the partner I was with at the time threatened to expose my HIV status publicly. I was not open about my status at that time. And I sat down and I made this drawing. And I was meditating on my relationship to the ocean as a place of release, escape, salvation. And I made this drawing while I was extremely afraid. I was afraid of the power that this man held over me because of my secret. And so I made a choice that at times I regret, but mostly I am grateful for, which is to have taken my power back and come out as HIV positive. It has deeply impacted my relationship to the world and my relationship to my practice. It is very surreal to be here for many reasons, because there are people in this room who, just through their advocacy and their existence, have paved a way for me to survive, to be here long enough to speak with you. One of those people is our keynote speaker, Didi Ngozi Chambly. And some years after I was diagnosed, I was in another low period. And I found a video of Didi speaking about her story, her activism, her advocacy, and her community. And it was Didi's story, along with many others, that shifted my relationship to addressing autobiographical content as an artist. There was a long time I didn't want to share my story, or I thought it was too individual or inconsequential or didn't matter. But I learned through learning about Didi's work that when we take control of our narrative, we transform our lives. And also that while we might be selves, we are not really individual. We are part of a collective kind of sentience. And so when we tell our stories, we keep an open space that reminds us of our collective power. And so I would like to thank all of you in the room who've brought me here today, and especially to Didi. After I dumped that asshole who tried to hold my status over my head, I began to reflect more on how HIV and AIDS had touched my life before I acquired HIV. Also, if I start going really over, someone's got to pull the stage hook out, and thank you. So I was reflecting on other periods in my life in which HIV in some way was sort of influential. And when I was an adolescent, I studied under the Jesuit Brotherhood. And I took art classes with the Jesuits, and we were only allowed to draw reproductions of religious figures, predominantly saints. And so when I was learning to draw, I was learning to draw by depicting Christ, Saint Francis of Assisi, Mary Magdalene, and Aloysius Gonzaga. This drawing is called Aloysius as a Woman, and it depicts the saint picking up a figure who I suppose is separate from him, or maybe is a double of himself in some other gender. Aloysius Gonzaga was a Jesuit Italian saint who died at the age of 23 in Rome during an outbreak of the plague. Gonzaga is considered to be a patron saint of Catholic youth, but is also considered a patron saint of those who are living with HIV and our caregivers. And so both these drawings that I've shown to you are while I was in lockdown, living in my apartment. All of my performance opportunities had been canceled and had dropped away, and so I returned to drawing and painting as a way to continue to make art without totally losing my mind. Recently, I've received a research scholarship to return to work on Gonzaga, and we'll be traveling to Rome next year to view his reliquaries, which are mostly in Italy. Part of my interest in him is really about the end of his life, mostly because the other Jesuits tried to convince him to not help the dying. Because he was physically weak and ill himself, they were afraid that he would contract the plague quite easily and die, and he refused to stop. And so the way Aloysius passed was from picking up the dying, bringing them into beds of rest. And he did contract the plague and passed shortly after. But my interest in him is that this story, which leads to his canonization, is centered around touch. In 2016, November of 2016, some days after Trump had won his election, I was in Texas performing for an exhibition at a school. And maybe some of you remember this. There were a series of articles and subsequent tension around university campuses in Texas around open carry laws. And not the school I was working with, but another school close by, while this exhibition was opening, had students and staff showing up on campus with firearms. The exhibition I was a part of featured predominantly queer artists, and there was a fear that students or staff would arrive with firearms during the exhibition. And I was scheduled to perform, and frankly, I was quite terrified. And I remember at the end of the performance, without really thinking about it, I asked everyone to come closer to me. Will you come closer? Will you come closer? This request repeated until everyone in the room refused. From that moment until May of this year, I have ended every performance I have done with that request. And so over an 8-year period, this gesture, which I call closer, becomes its own work, even though it is an action that sort of bookends every performance. Through repetition, it becomes a sort of durational choreographic score based on a singular question. And I wanted to show this image of the piece from 2018. It was the version of this gesture right before Sam saw this work, which they spoke about so beautifully in my introduction. I show this because I think it summarizes a lot about my practice, which is that I am interested in how things unfold over time and through repetition. I was able to ask this question over and over again and have the work emerge and evolve because the variables of the audience and the witness were always different. And so at times, this request has culminated in ways like Sam described, where masses of people are maybe in a space that seems like catharsis. It has also resulted in being assaulted. It has also resulted in only one or two people participating. And so each time, each iteration changes. My other long-standing gesture or project is the iconophagic act of ingesting images. I've been eating my own drawings since 2011. And here what you see is a performance at MoCA in 2022. It was my first performance after COVID, when I invited the very talented artist and dancer Gregory Barnett to attach a camera to his head and be my tripod. And so this camera that was attached to him was documenting very closely the ingestion of a set of images that no one in the audience was able to see. I was asked after the show why I didn't project the video for the audience. And what I wanted to underscore and make clear was that the lens somehow had the best seat in the house and was going to see something that no one else there would be able to see. And so what the audience witnesses in that moment is a certain kind of alienation from the screen and the gesture itself. It becomes less about what the images are and more about the act of their disappearance or transubstantiation into shit. I'm wrapping up. This is the most recent body of work that I just completed over the last 15 months. It's called Hiss the Name, and in many ways is dedicated to so many people that I have loved, but it is also dedicated to the people who have tried to destroy me and have failed. It is dedicated to the people who I don't have the privilege to name or hold accountable. I think many people who are survivors understand what that kind of isolation and alienation is. And so art is my antidote. Drawing and performance are the ways I get to say the things that I don't have the privilege to speak aloud. For 15 months, I made over 400 drawings, which were installed in various iterations across different gallery spaces over that time, and a subsequent set of performances which respond to the drawings. In a way, these drawings become an audience for myself in case there are no witnesses there. These performances range from 5 to 8 hours long, and so there are periods where it's just me and the work. There are other periods where people come in. I often scatter disposable cameras across the space, and what you often see in the documentation are anonymized documents from audience members who pick up the cameras and take photographs during the work. So the only images of the performances are from when an audience member is present. There is no stable, total recording of any of these pieces. They become multiple, fragmentary, and repetitive, much like the drawings themselves. In the iterations, as they have continued, I have embedded the photographs that audience members have taken back into the drawings. And so over time and through repetition, what begins to emerge is a series of imagistic portals. I have a collaborator, Miller Robinson, who describes them as telescoping, which I like as well. I included this because it was such a wonderful moment of interaction and collaboration with a witness. During one of the first performances of Hiss the Name, I returned the following day to the installation, and I saw this small cassette tape sitting on a chair in my installation. And I thought, who's putting shit in my sculpture? And I looked closer at the tape, and there was a photograph of the installation itself. An audience member had made a field recording of the work and very generously left it for me. This photograph is from the final performance and installation of Hiss the Name, where this recording was played, which just gives you another sense of how I approach the document. I'd like to end on this image and just say one last thing, which is that I was a thing, naming myself further into cinders, still lit and whispering. I was a mound of ash. I scattered the fire's ghost, and I blew through trees until I was back again. Thank you.